Welcome to the Supply Chain Podcast episode. Today, I, Isaac, am your host and will be discussing the supply chain of Starbucks and how Starbucks exploits the goodwill of its investors and business partners at the expense of people down the line and smaller farms and production companies around the world. Unfortunately, with Starbucks being as large as it is, these injustices go unnoticed, or if they are noticed, they are compared mentally to the massive corporation that Starbucks is and are dismissed as insignificant. The way this happens is in the forms of monopolizing trade markets and working around corporations in place to ensure farmers are paid a fair wage. The farmers in this chain rarely have the resources necessary to allow them to have the option to have a second thought of who they will sell to, or if they do, it's rare that they would also have the connections to another buyer to whom they could sell their product. As a result, Starbucks is able to manipulate farmers through tactics such as fixed-rate contracts, which disregard changing prices of production that affect the profit that farmers actually receive. First up, let's take a look at Starbucks' business plan from a bird's eye view. To do this, I will be referencing Shekhar Goel in his article, Starbucks Business Model and Supply Chain Analysis on the Strategy Story. Here, Shekhar Goel analyzes Starbucks' business model from outside the company. There are statistics that were likely taken from annual shareholder reports, and it provides commentary on the different strategies Starbucks uses to be profitable. He breaks down Starbucks' business model into how it sells products and how it sources products. Then he addresses the supply chain of Starbucks in more general terms. The sourcing of coffee is not specified, but there are details about how farmers are being supported, where food items, milk products, and plastic products are sourced from, as well as an effort to expand the use of reusable packaging. This article hints at there being resource centers that educate and ideally help farmers with the normal struggles that come from a career of expecting consistency in production while working with an inconsistent environment. However, this help may not be enough to counteract the strain that these contracts can put on farmers and the fact that these huge corporations essentially eliminate all competition from the buying market. So, even if farmers were to seek alternative buyers for their product, they would have a hard time escaping the somewhat suffocating effect that huge buyers such as Starbucks can have. With this relationship, the farmers are subject to the will of the buyer. For example, Shekhar Goel says, depending on market conditions, Starbucks buys coffee using fixed price and price-to-be-fixed purchase commitments to secure an adequate supply of green coffee. This shows that the buyer really has the power in this relationship, and there's little protecting the farmers from prices that will not give them a fair profit margin. Next, we will hear from a current Starbucks worker on a few subjects that relate to the Starbucks supply chain. So now leading to questions that have to deal more with the supply chain. Again, you may not know or necessarily have an opinion on these things, but just any information is great. During COVID, was there a change in the availability of certain products? If so, do you remember what any of these were?
Yes. Even just milk. At one point, oat milk was super short supply because of COVID and the small amount of workers that they had. We typically were out of everything. At one point, we didn't have caramel for weeks, which is a staple syrup in most of our drinks, or even vanilla. I remember it took us months during COVID to even have peach juice, which is another staple in a lot of our teas. So everything was super short supply. If we weren't out of one thing, we were out of another to make a drink. And supplies were just very limited. And also the supplies that we did get sent, wasn't very much of it. And so it would last a day.
Yeah.
And that's it. And so it was a very difficult time. A lot of people were angry. It was just a really bad time to work at Starbucks. I really didn't like it.
And then, okay. And then, what company delivered Starbucks materials to the store? Were they branded as Starbucks, or were they more individual companies? My background is at Chick-fil-A. Everything came on one truck, and everything was branded with Chick-fil-A branding, produced in Atlanta largely, but all our chicken, all our condiments, napkins, forks, everything came on once.
So typically I'm not super like well informed on this, just from what I've observed. We do have a lot of things that are like logoed with Starbucks, like our syrups, but in our cups and our napkins, but things like milk and like food that we sell up front is not Starbucks brand. Like juices are from different companies. Our water bottles are from different companies. So we typically have a Starbucks truck that comes every other day. Then we have, or like a few times a week, actually, like 4 times a week, I'd say, that brings like Starbucks branded things like syrups and stuff like that. And then every other day we have a truck that comes that are more so not branded Starbucks things, like milk, like all of our alternative milks, or things that we sell up front, which are just different brands and come from a completely different shipping company.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Of course.
From this, you can see that Starbucks, a massive company with many resources at its disposal, still faced challenges sourcing the things that it needed to produce their products. If such a company as Starbucks could see noticeable effects such that they can be recalled a couple years later, then surely the farmers in other, less connected countries face similar or worse shortages of the supplies they needed to produce their products. They could have been left without fertilizers for their crops, or, more likely, without parts or repairmen for the inevitable breakdown of farming equipment. And yet, these farming groups needed to have crops to sell to earn their living wages. So, in conditions that were less than desirable for farming, these fixed-price deals were most certainly in favor of the buyer, who could simply buy this suddenly harder-to-produce product at the same price, despite the increased hardship that certainly went along with providing it. Lastly, there is the suspicious move by Starbucks to withdraw from fair trade in favor of a different regulatory company. Fair trade is a company that promotes trade practices that ensure farmers are being paid a livable wage. According to Coffee Talk, in their article, Starbucks coffee will no longer be fair trade as retailers cut ties with charity in UK and Europe. They state that Starbucks has withdrawn from the Fair Trade certification scheme in favor of its own coffee and farmer equity cafe practices standards, which was developed in collaboration with Conservation International. It maintained that the standard, which has been in effect since 2004, is equally stringent, end quote. While this change may be altruistic, and the standards of this other regulatory body, CAFE, may truly be just as strict, these claims are coming from Starbucks, who would benefit from the public believing of the authenticity of this substitute company. It stands to reason that this alternate company, if it were both authentic in its requirements and big enough to resist potential pressures towards corruption from a huge company such as Starbucks, then there would likely be a positive review of them from some other source than Starbucks. Similarly, a Starbucks case study by Janen Patel, who is a University of West London graduate student, goes so far as to say, Starbucks, with its size and scale, has the power to take advantage of its suppliers, but it maintains a fair trade certified coffee under its Coffee and Farmer Equity Program, which gives its suppliers a fair partnership status, which yields them some moderately low power. While this claim is not very readily backed up with data, it still displays how, once again, the seller has little power even with the protective measures taken to defend them. And now we have come to the end of my episode of the podcast. To summarize, Starbucks is a massive corporation that has a lot of influence in the markets that it participates in, and as such, it has the power to practically eliminate its competitors. This leaves farmers at the mercy of Starbucks, who has also switched from a more mainstream regulatory company, Fairtrade, to a different company. All this to say, while there is little hard and fast documentation of every single transaction available to the public, it may be time to have someone do some digging in the darker corners of Starbucks' supply chain, because without that, there is not much stopping Starbucks from taking advantage of farmers or other parts of the supply chain that can do little to stand up for themselves.